In a town like Cold Creek, a good name was worth more than gold. And a bad one? A bad one was a death sentence. The morning light cut through the stained glass windows of the Methodist church, painting rainbows on the dusty floor. Reverend Franklin Bennett stood at the pulpit, a man carved from oak and scripture, his voice echoing like thunder rolling through the valley. "The path to salvation," he boomed, his knuckles white on the lectern, "is paved with righteousness. We cannot enter the kingdom of heaven if we harbor sin in our souls." The pews were filled with folks who understood righteousness. They lived it every day in the unforgiving Montana territory. They worked hard, prayed harder, and judged hardest of all. In Cold Creek, your reputation was everything. It was the currency that bought you help when the snows came, credit at the general store, and a neighbor's helping hand at harvest time. Lose that, and you lost everything. Just then, the heavy oak door at the back of the church creaked open. Every head turned, every neck craned. A gasp rippled through the congregation, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a tombstone. Standing there, silhouetted against the blinding morning sun, was Rebecca Bennett. Becky, the Reverend's own daughter. At 19, Becky was the town's pride. Dark, wavy hair like her mother's, eyes the color of a summer sky. She was the school teacher, the perfect example of grace and piety. But it wasn't her beauty that stole their breath today. It was the undeniable swell of her belly beneath her loose-fitting dress. A secret she could no longer hide, a truth that was about to bring the whole town crashing down. Reverend Bennett stopped his sermon mid-sentence. The Bible in his hands trembled. The silence in the church wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that comes right before an execution. Father and daughter locked eyes across the sanctuary. A chasm wider than the center aisle opened between them, a canyon carved by shame and broken faith. "Not today, daughter," the Reverend's voice rang out, cold and final, each word a hammer blow. "You are no longer welcome here." The words hung in the air, sharp and glittering like ice. Becky froze, one hand flying instinctively to her unborn child, the other gripping the doorframe. The color drained from her face, leaving it as pale as winter snow. Mrs. Abernathy in the front pew made the sign of the cross. Judge Wilson's wife turned away, as if Becky's condition were a disease you could catch. Only old Dr. Warren, sitting near the back, showed a flicker of compassion, but his wife yanked him back down into his seat before he could stand. Becky straightened her spine. From some deep, hidden well inside her, she summoned a sliver of dignity. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. Without a word, she turned and stepped back into the sunlight, closing the church door behind her with a soft, final click. The sermon resumed, but no one was listening. In that single, brutal moment, Rebecca Bennett had become a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered by mothers to their daughters, a symbol of sin in a town that had no room for it. But what they didn't know, what none of them could possibly imagine, was that this was not the end of her story. It was just the beginning. And the sin they all condemned, it was nothing compared to the secrets buried in the heart of Cold Creek. 3 months earlier, spring was just beginning to fight its way through the stubborn Montana winter. Becky sat by the creek that gave the town its name, sketching wildflowers in a worn leather book. She loved these quiet moments, away from the prying eyes of the town, away from the heavy silence of the parsonage she shared with her father since her mother's death. Footsteps crunched on the gravel behind her. "Thought I might find you here," a smooth voice said. It was Ethan Crawford. At 24, he was the town's golden boy, handsome, charming, with a smile that could melt the last of the winter snow. His father owned the biggest mercantile in 3 counties, and Ethan had just returned from business school back east, full of big plans and bigger ambitions. For 6 months, he'd been courting Becky, and the whole town, including her father, was just waiting for the wedding announcement. He sat beside her, taking her hand. His were soft, not like the calloused hands of the other men in town. "I've been thinking," he said, his blue eyes serious, "about us, about the future." Becky's heart did a little flutter. This was it. "Father has agreed to finance a new store in Helena," he went on. "A bigger house, finer things, a proper life for a wife and children." Are you asking me something, Ethan Crawford? She teased, her voice trembling just a little. I'm asking you to wait for me, he said. It'll take time to get the business established. A year, maybe two. 2 years. The words felt like a splash of icy creek water. 2 years. His smile tightened just a fraction. Success requires sacrifice, Rebecca. Your father taught you that, surely. She looked away. Her father had taught her all about sacrifice. He'd sacrificed his joy, his warmth, everything, on the altar of his grief after her mother died. He'd left Becky to navigate her own loss all alone. Then you'll wait, Ethan said, not asking, but telling. He was so confident, so sure of himself, so sure of her. And in that moment, with the sun on her face and the man she thought she loved beside her, Becky made the decision that would unravel her entire world. Yes, she whispered. I'll wait for you. What happened next was a blur of whispered promises and urgent passion. He drew her away from the creek into the shade of the cottonwood trees. He spoke of a love that was too strong to wait for a ceremony, of a bond that was already sealed in their hearts. If you truly love me, he'd breathed against her neck, prove it now. And she had. 6 weeks later, she knew. Pregnant, unmarried, the daughter of Cold Creek's moral compass. The terror was a physical thing, a sickness that rose in her throat. She told Ethan in the alley behind his father's store, after dark. His reaction was not what she dreamed of. Are you certain? He'd asked, his voice tight. There was no joy, no concern, only calculation. Dr. Warren confirmed it, she whispered. Panic flashed in his eyes, quickly masked. Okay. This complicates things. I'll have to leave for Helena sooner than planned. Once I'm established, I'll send for you. Relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. You'll still marry me? He hesitated for just a beat, but it was there, a tiny crack in his perfect facade. Of course, but we must be discreet. My father, the business, you understand. She nodded, desperate to believe him. I'll leave tomorrow, he said. I'll write as soon as I'm settled. He kissed her forehead, a quick, dismissive press of his lips, and then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness. He left the next morning. The only goodbye was a scribbled note. Business calls, will write. Yours, E.C. She waited. For 3 months, she waited for a letter that never came. She watched her body change, her secret grow, and her future crumble into dust. The whispers started, the sideways glances, the sudden silences when she entered a room. The town knew, or at least they suspected, and soon her father would have to know too. The confrontation happened in her father's study. The room was lined with books on theology and damnation, and it felt like the walls were closing in. Reverend Bennett listened to her confession, his face a mask of stone. You are with child, he repeated, the words dropping like chips of ice. Ethan Crawford's child. Yes, Father. He's gone to Helena to prepare for us. He'll send for me. He will do no such thing. The certainty in his voice was terrifying. He pulled a letter from his desk drawer. This arrived yesterday, from a business associate in Helena. I wrote to him, inquiring about Ethan's new enterprise. He handed her the letter. Her hands shook as she read the spidery script. Regarding your query about the Crawford Mercantile, I regret to inform you that no such establishment exists in Helena. The only Crawford I'm aware of is a young man who passed through last month, losing a considerable sum at the gaming tables before continuing on to Denver. The paper trembled. A mistake. There must be a mistake. There is no mistake, Rebecca, her father said, his voice devoid of any warmth. You have been deceived. You have allowed sin into your heart, and now into this house. Her world, which had been fracturing for months, finally shattered. Ethan hadn't gone to build a future for them. He had run. He had lied about everything. What? What will happen? She stammered. You will resign your teaching position, of course, he said as if discussing the weather. And then we will pray. We will pray for God's mercy and for guidance on how to proceed without bringing further shame upon my ministry. Shame. That was all it was to him. Not a grandchild on the way, not a daughter with a broken heart. Just shame, an inconvenience, a stain on his reputation. The weeks that followed were a living nightmare. She was a prisoner in her own home. Her father spoke to her only when necessary, his politeness more painful than any shouting. The town turned its back completely. Friends crossed the street to avoid her. She was utterly, completely alone. One evening she overheard voices coming from her father's study. She crept closer to the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was Mayor Wallace's voice, low and conspiratorial. "It's a practical solution, Reverend. The man is used to taking in strays." "I will not have my daughter treated like livestock," her father replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "Now, Franklin," the mayor soothed, "you know Blackwood's got a good reputation. Treats his animals fair. And Lord knows the man could use some company out on that spread of his." Blackwood, Matthew Blackwood. The name was a legend in Cold Creek, a recluse, a giant of a man who owned a massive ranch 15 miles north of town. A veteran of the war, they said, a man who preferred the company of cattle to people. He came to town once a month for supplies, a silent, solitary figure that children stared at and grown men stepped aside for. He was a force of nature, like a thunderstorm or an avalanche, and they were talking about sending her to him. "He's a good Christian man," the mayor pressed. "What I'm suggesting is practical. The girl needs a place to go. You need your reputation intact. Blackwood needs, well, who knows what Blackwood needs, but he has the space." Becky backed away from the door, her body trembling. They weren't just sending her away. They were disposing of her, hiding her like a dirty secret. Her father didn't tell her for 3 more days. 3 days of suffocating silence, of meals eaten without a single word exchanged. 3 days where the unspoken decision hung in the air like smoke. Then he summoned her to the parlor. Mayor Wallace was there, his hat clutched in his lap. "Your condition," her father began, pacing the room like a caged animal, "has become a source of difficulty. I have prayed on this. The Lord has provided a solution." He couldn't even look at her. "Mr. Blackwood has graciously agreed to take responsibility for you." The room spun. "You can't be serious. You can't just give me away." "I can and I will," her father said, his voice as cold as a grave. "He will provide for you until the child is born. After that, arrangements can be made. Arrangements. For her child. Like it was a package to be delivered. And if I refuse," she whispered, "then you are welcome to find shelter where you can," he said, "but not under my roof." In that moment, she saw him clearly. Not a man of God, but a coward. A weak man terrified of what his neighbors would think. A man willing to sacrifice his own daughter for the sake of his pride. "There are papers to be signed," Mayor Wallace said, pulling a folded document from his coat. "A simple agreement of guardianship. Perfectly legal. Mr. Blackwood assumes responsibility for your care." Her entire life, reduced to a few lines of ink on a piece of paper. She looked from the mayor's nervous face to her father's stony profile. There was no mercy there, no love, nothing. Something inside her, something that had been weeping for months, finally went hard and cold. "When am I to leave?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "Mr. Blackwood will arrive tomorrow morning," her father said, relief flooding his voice. "Be ready by 8. That night she packed a small trunk, a few dresses, her mother's Bible, her sketchbook. As she held her mother's worn Bible, her fingers traced a passage her mother had underlined years ago. "Love covers over a multitude of sins." In the margin, her mother had written, "Remember this always. God's love is bigger than human judgment." But human judgment was all she had left. She stood at her window, one hand on her belly, feeling the faint flutter of life within. "Your grandfather may not want us," she whispered into the darkness, "but I will never abandon you. Whatever comes, we will face it together." The next morning, at precisely 8 o'clock, the sound of wagon wheels on gravel announced his arrival. The knock on the door was firm, measured. Her father opened it, squaring his shoulders as if for a fight. And there he was, Matthew Blackwood. He filled the doorway. He was even larger than the story suggested, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by gray at the temples. But it was his eyes that caught her. They were deep-set, the color of weathered cedar, and they held none of the judgment she'd come to expect. They just saw her. "Reverend Bennett," he said, his voice a low rumble. He removed his hat. "Miss Bennett." He inclined his head toward her, not with pity, with respect. "The trunk is upstairs," he said, his gaze on Becky, not her father. He followed the Reverend up the stairs and returned moments later, carrying her trunk as if it weighed nothing. Her father produced the papers. Matthew glanced at them, his face unreadable, and signed his name in a strong, clear hand. Then he held the pen out to her. She looked at her father one last time, a silent plea. "Is this what you truly want?" His face was a stone wall. "It is for the best, Rebecca." With that, the last flicker of hope died. She took the pen and signed her name, signed away her life. The ride to the ranch was silent. The land grew wilder, the mountains rising up like jagged teeth against the sky. Becky braced herself for what she would find. A rundown shack, a life of drudgery and misery, a prison of shame. They crested a hill and the ranch spread out below them. It took her breath away. It wasn't a shack. It was a proper house, built of log and stone, nestled in a valley that looked like a piece of paradise. Barns, corrals, fences. Everything was neat, well maintained. It was a place of order and purpose. As they drew closer, she saw flower boxes under the windows, ready for planting. A vegetable garden, neatly tilled. "I've got a room ready for you," Matthew said as he helped her down from the wagon. His touch was brief, gentle. "It gets good light." He led her inside. The house was clean, filled with sturdy handmade furniture and shelves overflowing with books. It smelled of wood smoke and leather. He set her trunk at the bottom of the stairs and led her up to a room that faced the mountains. A beautiful handmade quilt in shades of blue and green covered the bed. A jar of fresh wildflowers sat on the dresser. But it was the thing in the corner that made her eyes fill with tears. A cradle. It was carved from the same dark wood as the porch railings, smooth as silk, polished to a soft gleam. It was the most beautiful, thoughtful thing she had ever seen. You made this," she whispered. Matthew shifted uncomfortably in the doorway. "Figured you might need it. It's solid. Should last." In a town where people crossed the street to avoid her, where her own father saw her child as a problem to be solved, this stranger, this giant of a man, had spent hours of his time carving a cradle for her baby, a baby he had no connection to, a baby he had no reason to care about. It's perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'll leave you to get settled," he said gruffly, clearly uncomfortable with her tears. "Supper's around 6, but you eat when you want, sleep when you want. This is your home now, for as long as you need it." He left, closing the door softly behind him. Becky sat on the edge of the bed, the afternoon sun warming her face. For the first time in months, the tight knot of fear and shame in her chest began to loosen. Her father had sent her here as a punishment, but as she looked around the sunlit room, at the mountains standing guard outside her window, at the beautiful cradle waiting in the corner, she had the strangest feeling. This wasn't a prison. This might just be a sanctuary. Life at Blackwood Ranch was nothing like she'd imagined. It was quiet, ordered, and peaceful. Matthew was a man of routine and few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He rose before dawn, and by the time Becky came downstairs, there was always fresh coffee on the stove. He never asked about her past, never mentioned Ethan or her father. He simply treated her as a person, a welcome presence in his silent house. She insisted on taking over the cooking, and while he protested at first, she could see the quiet pleasure it gave him. It gave her a purpose, too, a way to feel useful, not like a burden. They fell into a comfortable rhythm. He worked the ranch, she tended the house and the garden they'd planted together. In that garden, she planted the herbs her mother used to grow, sage, thyme, rosemary. It felt like planting a piece of her past, a piece of her mother, in this new uncertain future. Days turned into weeks. She learned the personalities of the animals. Duchess, the ancient, wise-eyed milk cow. Napoleon, the fiercely protective rooster who had to be bribed with corn to let her gather the eggs. And the horses, Belle and Smokey, who would nuzzle her palms, looking for the apple slices she'd started sneaking them. "They're good judges of character," Matthew had said one afternoon, watching her. "Animals know things about people that people sometimes miss." But for all his quiet kindness, Matthew Blackwood remained a mystery. A deep sadness clung to him like a shadow, and sometimes, late at night, she would hear him walking the floors downstairs, a restless, lonely sound. She found the answer by accident. It was a warm evening in May, and she was helping him sort through a mountain of paperwork on his desk. Reaching for a dusty ledger on the top shelf, her fingers brushed against a small wooden box, tucked away in the back. When she brought it down, Matthew froze. All the color drained from his face. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean to pry." "It's all right," he said, his voice rough. "I'd forgotten it was there." The box was beautifully carved, just like the cradle. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, was a Bronze Star military medal, and beneath it a small silver-frame photograph, a daguerreotype of a young woman with a gentle, happy smile. "Your wife," Becky said softly. It wasn't a question. "Emma," he whispered the name like a prayer. "She was everything good about this place. Everything I was fighting to come home to." "Tell me about her," Becky urged gently, and for the first time Matthew opened up. He spoke of a woman full of laughter, who could find joy in the smallest things. A woman who had filled this house with light. "We tried for children," he said, his voice thick with an old deep pain. "For years. She wanted to be a mother more than anything. Then the war came, and while I was away, the consumption took her." He looked up from the photograph, his cedar-colored eyes meeting hers. "She would have liked you," he said. "She would have said you had a strong spirit, that you'd survive things that would break lesser women." In that moment, a bond formed between them, a connection born of shared loss, of understanding the shape of the hole that grief leaves in a life. But their quiet moment was shattered by a sound from the valley. The frantic, desperate drumming of horses' hooves coming fast. Visitors were rare at the ranch. Unannounced visitors, riding that hard, meant only one thing: trouble. Matthew was on his feet in an instant. "Stay here." But Becky was already at the window. It was a boy from town, Billy Thompson, his horse lathered in sweat. He was carrying a letter, an urgent letter. Matthew met him on the porch. He broke the seal, his face growing grimmer with every word he read. He looked up at Becky, his expression unreadable. He handed her the letter. "It's from Dr. Warren," he said. "It's about your father. He's taken ill. Pneumonia." The news hit her like a punch. For all his cruelty, he was still her father. The letter went on to say that his condition was serious, and then a final line that made her blood run cold. "The congregation has been asking after you," the doctor had written. "Your father told them you were visiting relatives back east." A lie, another lie to protect his precious reputation. "Do you want to go to him?" Matthew asked. His voice was neutral, leaving the choice entirely hers. Did she? A part of her, the angry, wounded part, wanted to say no, wanted to let him face his illness alone, just as he had forced her to face her pregnancy, an eye for an eye. But another part of her, the part that remembered him teaching her to read, the part that still loved the father he used to be, couldn't turn her back. Not completely. In her mother's Bible, Sarah Bennett had written, "Forgiveness is not for the one who harmed you. It is for your own heart's healing." By morning, she had her answer. "I'll take you," Matthew said, and there was no judgment in his voice, only support. The journey back to Cold Creek felt like traveling to a foreign country. The town that had once been her entire world now seemed small, petty, and suffocating. Dr. Warren met them at his office, where he'd moved her father for better care. "He's weak, but the fever broke," the doctor said, leading them to a small room. Her father lay in the bed, diminished and frail. When he saw her, his face crumpled, the armor of his righteousness stripped away by illness, leaving only a vulnerable, frightened old man. "Rebecca," he whispered, "you came." "I came," she said, sitting beside him. He reached for her hand. It felt as light as a dry leaf. "I wouldn't have blamed you," he began, his voice raspy, "if you hadn't." I almost didn't, she admitted. They sat in a heavy silence. I've been reading your mother's Bible, he said finally, her notes in the margins. She understood things I never did, about love, about mercy. It wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was a start, a crack in the stone. As they rode back to the ranch that evening, with the sun setting behind the mountains, she finally allowed herself to use the word. I'd rather go home, she told the doctor when he suggested she stay in town. And she'd meant it. The ranch was home now. Matthew was home. That night she was woken by a sound that chilled her to the bone, a raw, desperate shout ripped from a place of deep pain. It was coming from Matthew's room. She found him sitting on the edge of his bed, head in his hands, his body racked with tremors. He was lost in a nightmare, his eyes wild and unseeing. Emma, he whispered. No, Matthew, she said gently. It's Becky. Reality crashed back in on him. He was drenched in sweat, his breathing ragged. I'm sorry, he mumbled. The war, sometimes I'm back there. She didn't leave. She sat with him in the dark, and for the first time, he told her about Antietam, about Bloody Lane, about being a young sergeant forced to order boys, his friends to charge up a hill into certain death. He spoke of the guilt he carried, a weight heavier than any stone. They gave me this for it, he said, his voice laced with self-loathing, gesturing to the bronze star in the wooden box. A medal, for leading my men to slaughter. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. It was a fist, clenched so tight the knuckles were white. My mother used to say, she whispered, that darkness loses its power when you bring it into the light. She began to sing, a simple hymn her mother had taught her, about peace and grace. As her quiet voice filled the room, she felt the tension slowly leave his body. The fist under her hand gradually unclenched. When she finished, he turned his hand and laced his fingers with hers. You remind me of her, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Not in looks, in spirit, the same kindness, the same strength. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and said, Becky, you don't have to bear your burdens alone either. Not anymore. The words were a promise that in this house, in this valley, two broken people could perhaps find a way to heal each other. But their fragile peace was about to be shattered. A few weeks later, a letter arrived. The handwriting on the envelope was bold, confident, and instantly recognizable. Ethan Crawford had found her. The letter was a masterpiece of arrogance and delusion. My dear Rebecca, she read aloud to Matthew, her voice shaking with rage. I have recently learned of your situation. I am disturbed to hear you have taken up residence with a stranger. I have concluded my business and am prepared to return to Coal Creek to claim what is rightfully mine. I expect you to end your current inappropriate arrangement. I will arrive by the end of the month to collect you and make proper provision for our family. Collect her, like she was a piece of luggage he'd left behind. He thinks he can just waltz back in, she fumed, crumpling the letter in her fist. What do you want to do? Matthew asked. The question was simple, direct, and powerful. Not what she should do, what she wanted. I want to burn this letter, she said, tears of frustration stinging her eyes. I want him to disappear and leave us in peace. Us. The word hung in the air between them. You belong here, Becky, Matthew said, his voice low and serious. Not because of some legal arrangement, but because this place needs you. Because, he hesitated, then took a deep breath. Because somewhere in these past months, watching you plant flowers and boss that rooster around and turn this house back into a home, I fell in love with you. The world stopped. The birds, the breeze, her own frantic heartbeat. Everything went silent. I love you too, she whispered, the truth of it blooming in her chest, warm and certain. I think I have for weeks. He took her hands. Then we fight him. He thinks he has a legal claim. We'll make a better one. He looked her directly in the eye, his gaze steady and true. Rebecca Bennett, will you marry me? It wasn't a marriage of convenience, not a desperate ploy for protection. It was real. This quiet, solitary man, who had shown her more kindness than she had ever known, was offering her not just his name, but his heart. Yes, she said, laughing through her tears. Yes, Matthew, I will. They had a plan. Ethan was coming at the end of the month. They had to act fast. Her father would never marry them. No preacher in Cold Creek would dare. But there was a circuit judge who came through Silver Ridge, a town 2 days' ride away. A man known for being more concerned with justice than with gossip. They set off the next morning. Becky wore her mother's best dress. In her hands, she clutched a bouquet of wildflowers from the garden they had planted together. The ceremony in the back room of the Silver Ridge Hotel was simple, witnessed by the hotel owner and his wife. But when Matthew slipped a simple gold band on her finger, and the judge pronounced them husband and wife, Becky felt a fundamental shift in the universe. She was no longer a fallen woman, a disgraced daughter. She was Mrs. Blackwood. She was loved. She was safe. They rode home as the sun began to set, their hearts full. The ranch, their home, looked more beautiful than ever, nestled in the valley, glowing in the golden light. But as they drew closer, a cold dread washed over Becky. There were horses tied to their porch rail, 3 of them. Smoke was curling from their chimney, and standing on the porch, waiting for them, was Ethan Crawford. He wasn't alone. Beside him stood Mayor Wallace and a sharp-faced stranger in a city suit. "Rebecca," Ethan called out, his voice smooth and proprietary, as if he were greeting a wife he'd seen only that morning. "Thank God you're safe. When I found the house empty, I feared the worst." Matthew brought the wagon to a halt, his body coiled with tension. "Crawford, you're early." "Business concluded sooner than expected," Ethan said, his eyes devouring Becky, lingering on her swollen belly. "I've come to take you home, away from this indecent situation." "My situation," Becky said, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed as Matthew helped her down, "is that of a properly married woman." She held up her left hand, the new gold band gleaming in the twilight. "Mr. Blackwood and I were wed this afternoon." The silence was absolute. Ethan's handsome face twisted, moving from shock to disbelief to pure, undiluted rage. "Impossible!" he sputtered. "You can't! That's my child!" "It's perfectly legal, I'm afraid," the stranger in the suit said, stepping forward. He introduced himself as Attorney Pearson, from Denver. "Mr. Crawford engaged my services to ensure a smooth resolution. This complicates matters." Matthew produced their marriage certificate, the ink still fresh. The lawyer examined it, his face grim. "The marriage appears to be valid. Mr. Crawford, your position is untenable." "Untenable?" Ethan shrieked. "That's my blood she's carrying. I have rights." "Actually," the lawyer said coolly, "you don't. Under territorial law, a child born in wedlock is legally presumed to be the child of the husband. From the moment of its birth, this child will be a Blackwood." The color drained from Ethan's face. He had been so certain, so sure he could just walk back in and claim her, claim the child, a neat and tidy solution to his inconvenience. He had never imagined she would have a life of her own, a will of her own. "This is a sham," he raged, turning to Mayor Wallace for support. "A mockery of a marriage, designed to steal what's mine." "Ethan," Becky said, her voice clear and cold, "you made your choice 8 months ago. I've made mine today. This man, my husband, showed me kindness when you showed me the door. He built our child a cradle while you were off at the gaming tables." "No," Matthew said, his voice a low rumble that promised violence if pushed. He stepped in front of Becky, a solid wall of protection. "The child belongs to the family that will love it and protect it. You are not part of that family, Crawford. You never were." Defeated, humiliated, Ethan and his companions mounted their horses. "This isn't over," he spat, his eyes burning with hatred. "I'll find a way to break this. That child is mine." He rode off into the gathering darkness, a ghost from a life she had finally left behind. Becky leaned against her husband, her hand on her belly, where their child kicked, strong and insistent. The first battle was won, but she knew with a chilling certainty that the war was far from over. The weeks that followed were a fragile peace. Life on the ranch was idyllic. Becky settled into her role as a wife, finding a deep, quiet joy in building a home with Matthew. Neighbors, hearing of their marriage, began to stop by. Most were kind, accepting the union with the practical, non-judgmental attitude of the frontier. They brought gifts for the baby, offered help with the ranch work. For the first time, Becky felt like part of a community. But the shadows were gathering. A letter arrived from her father. It was not a letter of reconciliation. "I have been informed of your marriage," she read aloud to Matthew, the words cold and cruel. "I am deeply disturbed. Mr. Crawford has not abandoned his claim. He has consulted with legal authorities and may seek to challenge your marriage on grounds of fraud. I cannot, in good conscience, acknowledge this union. Do not expect support from your family." He had disowned her. Completely. The next day, a writer brought the official summons. Ethan had done it. He was taking them to court. He was claiming Matthew had coerced her into a fraudulent marriage, solely to steal his child. A territorial judge was coming to Cold Creek to hear the case. They were to appear the next morning. Failure to appear would result in a warrant for their arrest. "What do we do?" she asked, the old fear clawing at her. Matthew looked out at the mountains that ringed their valley, his face set like granite. "We go to Cold Creek," he said. "We tell the truth, and we fight for what's ours." The courthouse was packed. It felt like the entire town had turned out to witness the spectacle. Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, looking smug and confident next to his high-priced lawyer. Becky, now 8 months pregnant and feeling as large and vulnerable as a ship in a storm, sat beside Matthew and the young, nervous lawyer they'd hired from Silver Ridge. Attorney Pearson was brilliant and ruthless. He painted a picture of a scheming, lustful recluse preying on a helpless, pregnant girl. He twisted Matthew's kindness into manipulation, their love into a legal sham. "And we have evidence," Pearson declared, his voice booming through the silent room, "that Mr. Blackwood and Miss Bennett were living in immoral circumstances for months. Dr. Warren will testify to their sinful relations." A wave of murmurs and gasps went through the crowd. Becky's face burned with shame. Then at the back of the courtroom, a figure appeared. Her father. He walked slowly down the aisle and took a seat in the front row, his face an unreadable mask. Had he come to testify against her? To drive the final nail into her coffin? The proceedings were a nightmare. Dr. Warren was called to the stand, and under Pearson's clever questioning, he reluctantly implied that he'd seen evidence of impropriety at the ranch. Things looked bleak. Their young lawyer was flustered, outmatched. It seemed Ethan was going to win. He was going to take her child. And then, the courtroom doors burst open. A man stood there, breathless, clutching a piece of paper. "Your Honor," he gasped, "this can't wait. It concerns this case." The judge, irritated, took the document. As he read it, his expression changed from annoyance to shock to cold fury. He looked from the paper to Ethan, then to Dr. Warren. "Dr. Warren," the judge said, his voice like cracking ice, "approach the bench." The doctor went forward, his face pale. The judge showed him the paper. A hushed, frantic conversation took place. Dr. Warren seemed to shrink, his head bowing in shame. After a long, tense moment, the judge addressed the court. "This court has received new evidence," he announced. "A sworn affidavit from the family of a young woman in Silver Creek. A woman who alleges Mr. Crawford engaged in improper behavior with her last year, resulting in a pregnancy." A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. "This young woman," the judge continued, his eyes boring into Ethan, "took her own life after Mr. Crawford abandoned her." The revelation was a thunderclap. Another girl, another baby, another abandonment, but this one ending in tragedy. "Furthermore," the judge said, his gaze shifting to the doctor, "Dr. Warren has just confessed he was aware of this situation, but was paid by the Crawford family to remain silent." The room erupted. Ethan was on his feet, shouting, but his words were lost in the chaos. Just then, a sharp, searing pain shot through Becky's abdomen. She gasped, clutching Matthew's arm. It wasn't a Braxton Hicks contraction. This was real. "The baby," she whispered. "It's coming." Matthew didn't hesitate. He was on his feet, lifting her into his arms. "Your Honor, my wife needs a doctor." "This is a trick," Ethan bellowed, but his words were cut short by Becky's cry of pain as another contraction, stronger this time, ripped through her. "This hearing is suspended," the judge declared. As Matthew carried her toward the door, a voice stopped them. Wait, it was her father. He stood, his tall frame commanding silence. He walked not to Ethan, but to the judge's bench. Your Honor, he said, his voice ringing with a lifetime of practice. I came here today not to support Mr. Crawford, but to confess my own sins. He turned, his eyes finding Becky's. I preached love while showing none to my own child. I valued my reputation more than my daughter's welfare. When she needed me most, I cast her out. He moved to stand before Becky and Matthew. This man, he said, gesturing to Matthew, his voice thick with emotion, succeeded where I failed. He saw my daughter's worth when I saw only shame. He offered her safety when I offered judgment. The marriage you see before you is no fraud. It is love. The kind of pure, true love I was too proud and too foolish to give my own daughter. The confession, so public, so complete, stunned the courtroom into silence. The judge looked from the redeemed preacher to the disgraced scoundrel, and then to the couple at the center of it all. In light of this testimony, he announced, his gavel coming down with a deafening crack, this court finds no evidence of fraud. The marriage is declared valid. Mr. Crawford, your petition is denied. Your parental claims ended when you abandoned your responsibilities. Now get out of my courtroom. As Matthew carried her out into the sunlight, a free woman, a beloved wife, Becky knew the nightmare was finally over. 6 hours later, in a quiet room at Dr. Warren's house, Sarah Grace Blackwood was born. She was perfect, with a shock of dark hair and a cry that promised she would be a fighter. Matthew held her, his big, calloused hands impossibly gentle, tears streaming down his face. Her father came in, his own eyes wet. Sarah, he whispered, hearing his late wife's name. And Grace, he added, because that's what this is, a grace none of us deserved. He took Becky's hand. Can you ever forgive me, daughter? I'm learning, she said, looking from her father to her husband, to the tiny, perfect child in his arms. That forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you give. Months later, spring returned to the valley. The wildflowers they had planted together bloomed in a riot of color. Sarah, healthy and happy, laughed on a quilt on the porch as her grandfather, the retired Reverend Bennett, tickled her belly. Matthew, her father in every way that mattered, came out of the house with lemonade, a quiet, contented smile on his face. Ethan Crawford had vanished, reportedly gone back east, a bitter footnote in a story that had become about so much more than him. As the sun set, painting the mountains purple and gold, Matthew wrapped his arm around Becky. Sarah slept on his shoulder, her tiny hand curled around his finger. I was thinking, Becky said, leaning her head against him, about how what looks like an ending can sometimes be a beginning, how a punishment can become a blessing. Your father meant to punish us both, Matthew said, his voice a low rumble against her ear. And look what grew from it. He gestured to the peaceful ranch, the thriving garden, the sleeping child in his arms, their family, forged not by blood or obligation, but by choice, by kindness, by a love that had blossomed in the most unexpected, unforgiving soil. They had faced down the judgment of the world and built a life of their own, a life filled with grace. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the wild frontier.